Welcome to the Hallenstein Center's live webcast, Lunch and Learn. I'm your host, Gleaves, Whitney. Today, we tackle the toughest issue in the American experience, race. From slavery to Jim Crow to separate but equal to the modern civil rights era, nothing has challenged Americans more than living up to our founders' promise in the Declaration of Independence and Northwest Ordinance to recognize the right of African Americans and all people of color to full civic, economic, and social participation in American life. It has taken more than 2 centuries for us fully to embrace that the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness should not be dispensed according to race. To help us understand the difficult terrain of American race relations, as well as to the mountain still to climb, I've asked Ken James to join me. Ken is a Laker. In 1996, he earned his master's degree in public administration at Grand Valley and currently serves as the Director of Inclusion at the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce. Ken and I will explore the intersection of Black Lives Matter with our business communities, and we will dive into the racial inequalities within our nation, the current unrest and protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd, and the impact and response that we are seeing here in our Grand Rapids community. My conversation with Ken will go 30 or 40 minutes or so, followed by questions from our viewers. So feel free to begin sending your questions to us right away using your Zoom toolbar to do so. Ken, thank you for joining me today.
Gleaves, it's an honor to be here, and I am a Laker for a lifetime, so I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Go Lakers, way to go.
Go Lakers.
Well, first, Ken, let me just ask you, because I want this conversation to be real. How are you and your family doing at this extremely disruptive time in American history?
I'll share a little bit later when we get into my bio about my family, but I am married with 3 kids at home. And so thank you for asking that question. It is something, and I'm going to throw a word out there. I'm going to throw out self-care. So I actually shared with some of my teammates when the George Floyd incident happened, which was on a Monday. I began to get calls from family, friends, and colleagues, and I was absorbing a lot of tension and different things. And for a day or two there, I forgot about my own, opportunities to check out and to refresh. And then once I do that, I can still continue charging in this work. And so since I reminded myself of the self-care, it's been going well. So I check out when I need to and do the things that give me that refreshing ideology. And then the next morning I take off with it. And then also with my kids, in the fall, I'll have a 8th, 9th, and 10th grader respectively. I've been fielding their questions as well and answering them to the best of my ability.
Good to hear. Well, to set the table for our conversation today, tell us a little more about yourself, your family background, the community in which you grew up, your education, and what prepared you specifically to do the work of the Director of Inclusion at the Grand Rapids Chamber.
All right. Well, I'll share with those that are listening. I call San Diego, California home, and that is attributed to United States Navy. My dad was a career Navy man. He spent 24 years in the Navy. So me and my siblings were born wherever my dad was stationed at the time. For me, that was San Diego, California. And being the youngest, my parents decided to stay in San Diego when he retired, and he took on a second career at San Diego Gas and Electric. So I call San Diego home. So birth through high school, I was there. I attended Kentucky State University, which is an historically Black college, on a football scholarship many years ago. And when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I heard about this fine institution, and I'm going to date myself here, Gleaves. I graduated my bachelor's in '94. I moved here in '94 and started my master's full-time, and I was on a 2-year plan. I was going to get my master's at Grand Valley and then go somewhere warm. And here we are this many years later, and I'm still here. But I'm married. I have 3 daughters, so I am outnumbered at home. My wife is also a Laker, so we have strong ties to the university. And in that time that I've been here, my career has spanned the different career fields of nonprofit, higher education, corporate retail, and healthcare. And so I've done a number of roles in there. I've held positions that did training and development, affirmative action, equal opportunity, recruitment and talent acquisition. But all of my career, I have had a lens on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've been with the Grand Rapids Chamber for the last 3 years. And right now I'm serving as a Director of Inclusion here at the Grand Rapids Chamber.
Tell us more about what the Director of Inclusion does.
Okay. So I am a point of contact for our members. The Grand Rapids Chamber has over 2,400 members. Many Grand Valley's a member, so many of the businesses, I could name that you would recognize. But I'm a point of contact if they want to have a conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. And that could apply to supplier diversity, growing their own employee force, resolving any issues that may have come up in their employee force. And we do that through a number of programs. So we offer some tools here. We do an assessment for diversity, equity, inclusion. We offer implicit bias training. We offer the Institute for Healing Racism, and we do some organizational and communication training. So these are all services that we provide. And also congruently with that, I do the internal training for our team here to make sure that we are as welcoming as we need to be for our members.
And I think Grand Valley is a partner in some of these, are we not?
That's correct. So kudos if they're listening. We do a lot of this work with the Division of Equity Inclusion at Grand Valley. So shout out to Dr. Jesse Burnell and Dr. Marlene Kowalski-Braun. To name a few, I don't want to get naming names, but those are two individuals I work with very closely as we do this diversity work for our community.
Well, they're fantastic colleagues, I can tell you that.
Yes.
Well, I'm glad that Grand Valley is a partner in this important work. And you've used a couple of terms. I just want to make sure listeners understand the definitions of the terms. So you use the term, for example, implicit bias. Mm-hmm. What is implicit bias?
Mm-hmm. And I'll answer that, and I have some notes here to make sure I don't jumble my words. But implicit bias is the process of associating stereotypes or attitudes toward categories of people without conscious awareness. So it's an implicit bias. It's something we all have, Gleaves. One of the things that we offer is implicit bias training because we want individuals to acknowledge that we all have biases because our life is just that. Everything that we've experienced has created our narrative. Then we're thrust into these diverse environments, maybe diversity at work, where we volunteer, where we worship. And then we'll encounter something and we'll see it totally different than someone else because of our experience. So we don't discount that experience, but because it's different, we may perceive it differently. And we want to make sure how we react to that experience is part of our awareness. So we want to bring some attention to that implicit bias.
And I imagine also one of your goals, and of course there at the Chamber as well, is to attract and retain talent and yes. A diverse workforce. Speak a little bit to that.
Absolutely. So the work that we do at the Grand Rapids Chamber, I'm part of a team, an overall business service team, and there are components to business success. Make sure, obviously, they have the tool they need, they understand their niche, that they have a product that people want to purchase, or they're doing a good or a service. But at the same time, a big part of that is their workforce. So we want to make sure their workforce, if they are inclined to, mirror the community of which they serve. If their workforce is diverse, and we mean all lenses of diverse, not just racial, socioeconomic status, gender, we can go on and on, LGBTQ status. We want to make sure that workplace is welcoming, because you'll see a lot of data on business that a diverse workforce can outperform a homogenous workforce. But there is a caveat to that. They must feel welcome, included, and can bring their authentic self to work. So the programs that we offer at the Grand Rapids Chamber help with that attraction and retention of talent by fully engaging the workforce so people can bring their authentic selves to work.
A couple of other terms. Let's get these definitions out of the way early in our conversation, because we've been hearing them, and I think there's sometimes confusion over exactly what these terms mean. But would you please define systemic racism for us?
Absolutely. More than happy to do that. Gleaves, if you'll allow me, there are 4 levels to racism. And we've been hearing the word systemic or institutional racism a lot right now because of what's going on in our nation. And I'd love to give you my opinions on that. But there is internalized racism, which is what lies within individuals. There is interpersonal racism, which is what occurs between individuals. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on that because you can recognize that and you see it. But in addition to the internalized and the interpersonal racism, we have systemic or institutional racism. And that's the racism that occurs within institutions. And that's the policies, the practices, the things that keep, whatever is being marginalized down. And then to go a step further than that, there's structural racism. So in the United States, we have a system of structural racism where the cumulative legacy of racism still exists in a lot of the entities that we have today. So again, to recap, there's internalized racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and structural racism.
And so, for example, the Ta-Nehisi Coates has drawn a lot of attention in his articles in the Atlantic on, say, the redlining in banks in Chicago, for example. That would be an example, I guess, of both systemic and structural racism,
Right.
correct?
Yeah. And for anyone listening, redlining is, the practice of, there's a certain part of town that I think is more geared toward a certain, it's a good place for business. So they'll try to draw a line as to who can go in and to who can go out of that particular community. And it's normally a red line. And so we'll still all the bankers and the financial institutions, we'll steer them to this part of town. Whereas there's another part of town where, we're not as quick to invest in. We'll redline over here, we won't do that. So there's a history of that right here in Grand Rapids, where redlining has taken place. And as a community, we're still trying to recover from that.
And how do you define white privilege? Another term we hear a lot these days.
Yeah, so white privilege is defined, Gleaves, as the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices bestowed upon people solely because they are white. So that's the term of white privilege, and so people operate in that. And I'll go, even a little further with that. These are some very strong terms that I'm throwing out, and there's a history behind that. And when we have these conversations, we can talk about it. And so one of the things, and I think it ties in, you had mentioned Black Lives Matter. When you talk about systemic racism and you talk about white privilege, I have an opinion. I think that there is an extreme in any society. And so there's an extreme of people that are racist, but I think most people are not just wake up in the morning and I don't like a particular person because of how they look. So let's just assume for a minute the majority of America feels that way. But by bringing attention to these topics, that the way the country is set up, that white people can operate in a system of privilege, sometimes they can continue to perpetuate some of this systemic racism unknowingly. And I think that is what is causing a lot of conversation right now when we look at what has happened to George Floyd, Brianna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery.
I'm curious, since you run a lot of these workshops, you teach the tools for dealing with implicit bias and racism. How have your audiences here in West Michigan, for the most part, responded to your programs? And what's been the most rewarding part of your interaction and the most frustrating part?
Gleaves, I would answer that. I think overall, it's worth it. I feel I have an obligation as a Black man to continue this work. So anytime I can shed knowledge on white privilege, if I can address what is an institutional racism and start to break those things down. So overall, it's been favorable. People seek out our programs, and the Chamber offers these programs, and people leave impacted. But I won't candy coat it. There are times where the conversation is challenging. Sometimes people are resistant to the term white privilege, or they feel that it's attacking their norm, or they feel that this is too heavy of a burden, the feelings of guilt that are taking place. And so I try to say, I don't candy coat it. When you look at our history, it's painful. However, we have to acknowledge what happened in our past so we can move forward in our future. So I will say, not what frustrates me, but sometimes I have to spend a lot of time having that conversation of people that are trying to get it, and for some reason they're not getting it. And so we continue that conversation, but we stay the course. We let the facts prove what it proves, and hopefully we'll do the change. And I'm driven by the fact that it's making a change. So think of a pond that is on a smooth day and it's just there, and you throw a stone into the middle of the pond, well, you get that ripple effect. So if each one reaches one, eventually you'll start having a positive ground swelling. So the work that I do, impacting one person at a time, which leads to individual change, departmental change, organizational change, community change. I like to think that what I'm doing is making a positive effect.
A really controversial term in some circles nowadays is Black Lives Matter. Now, to me as a white man, originally from the South, by the way, when I hear Black Lives Matter, I think of two things. The first is, of course, Black Lives Matter. It's just a statement of principle that we should cherish all life. Black lives matter, absolutely. A lot of people, I think, are also thinking of Black Lives Matter with all caps as a movement with a very specific organization and a very specific agenda. Help us sort out these two things with Black Lives Matter. On the one hand, of course, Black Lives Matter. On the other hand, here's an organization with a specific agenda.
Mm-hmm. I would like to share my take on that. When Black lives, do matter, I support that statement. But for anyone that's struggling with that, the intent, and this is my interpretation of it, but the intent of that is not to alienate any other race. What it is to draw attention to what has happened disproportionately to people that look like me, to Black and brown people. So if you'll take a look, there's lots of data that, police brutality, the different forms of discrimination, I don't have to list them all here, happen to people that look like me or that are Black and brown. So the notion Black Lives Matter is to bring attention to that. What it is not doing is alienating any other race. And I actually got this off of the internet, so it's not my original idea, but I thought someone explained it well. And they said, it's almost, if you remember back to the tragedy that happened at the Boston Marathon when someone had let off some IED devices and people were there, and they put out the hashtag Boston Strong. Well, you didn't see, someone else say, well, what about Chicago or what about Miami? It wasn't discounting other cities. What it was is just like we were unifying around a collective cause. So the Black Lives Matter is, rallying around a collective cause, that we want to draw attention to the fact that people that look like Ken James are being, killed by the hands of police, at a high alarming number that far outweighs the percentages of the number of Black people that are in our population. Number of counters with Black, there's a lot of data that we don't have to get into, but that's how I'd answer it, is not to take away from anyone else, it's to draw attention to a fact, and it actually is a call for unification.
Okay. Well, you and I are old enough to remember, I know I'm older than you, but we both are old enough to remember the Rodney King video. Mm-hmm. And that was close to your hometown, just up the road a little bit, PCH1. And we also remember, Ken, the verdict, the jury verdict later. Mm-hmm. How did you, as a Black American, react to that?
Yeah, and actually, and I think that latches to what's going on now in this regard. So 1992, we have the video beating of Rodney King. And so I was in college at the time that took place. And I remember because as Black men, we said, wow, it's finally caught on tape. This is going to be exposed. And if you recall, as tragic as the video itself was, the riots did not take place until the verdicts came out. So after a video, and if anyone has seen it, it's troubling to watch. But after that video, those 4 officers were found not guilty. That is what sparked the riot, not the beating itself, as bad as that was, it was the verdict. Because again, that draw attention to the systemic racism. So again, as a Black man standing here, I don't condone violence. I don't condone destruction of property. But I do think we should not lose sight of what has been the driving force behind that rage. And it is the calling of attention to systemic racism and what appears to be no action taken. So fast forward, 20 years later, something similar happened. And so Gleaves, I'll dive in. I've had people from different races reach out to me and ask with the George Floyd statement, well, why are so many people, latching their wagon to someone that had a criminal record? And I say, let's not look at the fact, right, wrong, or guilty, but in this country, you're innocent until proven guilty. What you saw play out there was a manifestation of many years of systemic racism, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of someone being robbed of their life. That was that lit the fuse of something that was already laid. So in the midst of a pandemic, we have systemic racism come up. And so what you see of these protests that are still taking place across the nation is drawing attention to the systemic racism. So I would challenge anyone that's struggling with George Floyd as an individual, and I do think he was murdered, that's my opinion, that's tragic, and I can see that playing out with me because the outcome was death and it didn't have to be in that situation. And so let's talk to the situation of how do we get to this point and how can we fix it? The other thing is you mentioned we're at an age long enough. I know I have peers and then I have people that are older than me say, we've had these conversations for generations. When is it going to end? So I want to be part of the force for change. I'm about convening, I'm about collaborating, and I'm about unification. no, it's not going to be easy. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight, but we're going to continue to work for it. So I think we should use this to collectively address that systemic racism.
You mentioned, of course, George Floyd is central to this. And as a historian, I always ask, why now? I mean, why was the murder of George Floyd the spark that became a conflagration just 2 weeks ago on Memorial Day, Ken? I mean, what is it about this summer, this June, this May and June?
I think that it was the opportunity to address this. So I mentioned two other names, Brianna Taylor. Many may be aware of that. She was shot in her home. And that wasn't brought to light, and again, until some other things were exposed. We have the Ahmaud Arbery, which again, something that happened that didn't appear to be justified. But again, that's something that it may have been buried if a video hadn't leaked. So again, I think what you have here is George Floyd, and my sympathies go out to his family, is what sparked a larger issue, and now is the time to address that issue.
And in the midst of all of this, we do hear a number of people and commentators who are highly thought of on television or on YouTube echo Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and ask, well, why can't we be colorblind? Why do we have to look at Mr. Floyd's race, for example?
And I would answer that in Gleaves. I've had well-meaning individuals say to me, Ken, I don't see race, I don't see color, and I know what they mean. I would challenge someone to say not be colorblind, but to be color conscious or color aware, because I am an individual. I have things. So why wouldn't you see me? Is my challenge to that. So again, if anyone out there I think I know what they're trying to say when they're colorblind, that they don't perpetuate racism. However, I think we should move toward being color conscious or color aware. And then we talked earlier about implicit bias. There are some proven biases that people and stereotypes that people that look like me have to endure.
Now, you just said a moment ago you're interested in not just a narrow approach to this kind of reconciliation that you're looking at. So you're not just interested in, say, a Democratic or a Republican approach or a liberal or a conservative solution. It sounds to me, and from our conversations, that you're interested in a broad racial reconciliation that transcends any allegiances to a group. And I want to ask you, based on your work, how do we actually get there? How do we get a new narrative going about our relationship with people who are different from us and who we tend to other?
I think conversation and dialogue, but it has to lead to real action. So one thing I can say to start is to listen. And like I said, this to me, in my opinion, it does transcend, when we talk about this country, and just to listen. So as a former athlete, I use a lot of sports analogies. And so one that I'll share with you, there's many of them out there, but if anybody's familiar, NFL and some of the prominent players get inducted into a Hall of Fame. And a couple of years ago, Champ Bailey, longtime defensive back for the Denver Broncos, was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And he used that platform at his Hall of Fame induction speech to say, listen to the stories that we tell. And he told a story of a Black man living in an affluent part of Denver, how many times he was pulled over. And he would share that story with others, and it was minimized. Oh, you're overreacting, or oh, the police were just doing their job. And so that's just one example of when someone is telling their story, let's start by listening to their story, because their reality is just that, their reality. So by listening, then we can say, okay, what has to happen differently? Because now I can take that with me. I heard Ken's story. That doesn't happen to me, or I don't see why it's there. What can I do to change that narrative? And so there's some other things on that. And so when you minimize it, it might lead to a microaggression. So, I do have times where I wanted to tell my story and people say, oh, Ken, I don't think they were doing it that way. Well, I know when I've been the victim of a microaggression and to do that. So I would say, let's start by listening. But then secondly, once we listen and we realize that there is a different narrative, how do we make that change, please? So again, we have some tools that work at the chamber, but it's not about that. What we're talking about is bigger than that. There are other tools out there. I think it's to take the right step. What works for you as an individual? Make the step. What works for, where you have influence, where you volunteer, where you worship, where you work. to help that organization or that institution make that step. So, so again, I think it does transcend everything, but it starts with listening and then, being empathetic and then having action around that.
Ken, I want to make sure that our viewers understand some of the terms you're using. So, for example, you just used the word microaggression. Could you please define microaggression and give us an example?
I can do that. Again, I don't want to misspeak. So a microaggression are statements, actions, or incidents that are perceived as indirect or subtle, but are really unintentional discrimination, and they happen to members of a marginalized group. So to give an example of a microaggression is, Ken, you don't sound like a Black guy. You're so articulate. How am I supposed to take that? You're so articulate for a Black guy. That's an example. Did it bring tears to my eyes? Did it really hurt me? No. But again, if that's the something, and I have to endure that every hour of every day while I'm at work, well, what is the cumulative effect of that? So that's an example of a microaggression. And so when going back to the story I just shared, so if I'm talking to my employer and I say, you know what, I'm enduring these microaggressions and it's minimized, Ken, they don't mean it that way, Ken. That's not really happening to you. So then it exacerbates the problem. But that's an example of a microaggression.
Okay, thank you for that definition. Well, as we look at illustrations of ways to move forward, you've proposed several things. It seems to be in your DNA to want to try to reconcile and really be a peacemaker and a problem solver in this whole process in our country. How important is white allyship to this movement?
I would reach out and say it's very important to the movement. One, we want to break down those barriers. So again, if one that is white, this is my opinion, becomes aware of their white privilege, just to share those narratives. But the other thing is, and I'll say this, so I do diversity training at a number of institutions. And hypothetically, if I walk into company X and I'm there to do some diversity training, well, as a Black man standing in front of the group, I'm supposed to stand in that soapbox, people might think. But if someone comes in and says, this is why this is important for me, then the message permeates to some people that saying, yeah, Ken is supposed to check that box. But when it's checked by a partner, an ally, someone standing side by side with me in that work, I think it just goes a little bit further. So I think one of the key ingredients to the solution, we're talking about what transcends, conservative, liberal, whatever side of the political aisle you fall on, I think allyship will help bridge that gap as well.
Here at the Hauenstein Center, in particular at the Cook Leadership Academy, we put a lot of emphasis on trying to reseed common ground. We know we've lost so much in the last decades, and we're trying to find ways both procedurally to bring people together and figure out how to listen to each other, and also substantively, are there issues around which we can really reseed common ground and make progress in this country? I mean, as you know, I think you and I both share this view. We're in a democracy. It's no longer just a multi-ethnic democracy. A lot of people a few decades ago grew up in a multi-ethnic democracy. We're a multicultural democracy now. We've got to make this incredible democratic experiment work, and it's going to be hard work. So I guess I would like to know from you, in all of your work, what is your message about the possibilities of reseeding, planting new roots for common ground?
And I heard that question, Gleaves, and it's a great question. I think we have to stay the course. So there's been some foundational things out there that we can't, rest on our laurels. I think we need to get beyond checking the box. And so what I mean by that is, we have a chance to have real racial dialogue right now. And my hope would be someone wouldn't take an opportunity to say, okay, we had a conversation around race in the month of June in 2020. Now everything's back to normal. So it needs to be something that we can do and sustain the work, because it is about harmony. I come from the business lens, and if you have a workforce that is truly engaged, I talked about earlier, your chances of outperforming your peers go up tremendously. So how do you have that dialogue so people can bring their authentic selves to work? So again, using a hypothetical, so if somebody comes back to work, we're coming back to work in a post-COVID world. We have to have the internal capacity to have this racial discussion. So if I'm coming back to company X and it's 200 people on my floor here, and somebody does wear a Black Lives Matter shirt, are we ready to have that discussion? And if not, what do we have to do to have it so that we understand why it's there? So I would say, let's not rest on our laurels. Let's not do a one-time check the box. How do we weave into the fabric of the foundations of our organization that we're having conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, particularly race?
It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. We're going to be coming back to work in sort of this racial hotbed, of recent weeks, and how do we practice social distancing at the same time that we're trying to achieve a greater understanding and unification? It's going to be particularly challenging, I imagine. Well, how do you assess what's been going on in Grand Rapids in our community?
So, that's a good question. There are a lot of tools there. I'm entrenched there, but I do see a lot of unification there. We have some great leadership in our community. And so when you ask me that question, two things come to mind. So, a couple of Saturdays ago, we had a peaceful protest here. And I saw 3 events that day, Gleaves, and others have shared this, and I'm agreeing with them. We had a peaceful protest that went over well. And then as day turned to night, we had a few agitators that did some destruction of property that's there. And so, like I told you, I don't condone violence or destruction of property. But I also say that let's not lose sight as to what that spark was, and that was the issue of systemic racism. But the following morning, this happened on a Saturday night. Sunday morning, if any of you were aware, we saw the best of our community show up and take care of the damage that was done. And so I drove through and saw people of different races, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status saying, this is not our Grand Rapids, talked about the night before, this is our Grand Rapids that we can heal together and have this conversation together. So that's something that I manifested. And then Gleaves, if you would allow me, I also would like to share, we talked about systemic racism. If you haven't picked up, I try to share analogies to kind of paint the picture that goes home, so kind of sink in. And so in this country, we all know we've had a Black president. Barack Obama served two terms as our president. We have, who comes to mind? Oprah Winfrey. We have a Black billionaire. But that doesn't mean racism is gone because we've had a Black president or we have a Black billionaire. And so that's the one thing that I would say for the mainstream. We still have a long way to go. And you even take that down into this community. In Kent County, our Kent County administrator is a Black man. Our city manager in Grand Rapids is a Black man. One of the presidents of our local college is a Black man. And they are phenomenal individuals and are doing a lot of great leadership in this work. But does that mean we don't have racism in Kent County? We have racism in Kent County. And that's what I want to tell you. So even though we have Black men in prominent positions, I want to say, let's not lose sight of, that systemic racism and work to, undo that.
You have covered a lot, and you obviously have so much passion for this issue. I want to know, I think viewers want to know, who really inspires you to do this work? Two things. So one, I do have a personal hero. My dad is one of the strongest Black men that I know. My dad was born in the 1930s in a very segregated South, and he joined the Navy and was able to provide for his offspring because of that. So we thank our country for that. And he had a goal for all of his kids to get through college, and we've accomplished that, and then some. So we've all gotten through college and even have some post-bachelor's degrees there. So that is one of my heroes. And then also in the work that I've done, I feel an obligation to make the world better than I found it, in my opinion. And there is a quote from 1936 when Jesse Owens was asked to represent the United States in Berlin during the Olympics. And anyone can Google that and see how well Jesse Owens did. But he said, the measure of a Black man is not how high he climbs up on the ladder, but how many other Black folks he pulled up on the rung beneath them. And that mantra kind of works well with me. When it's all said and done, I'm not going to do this forever. If I can look back and know that I helped make a change and pull people up for the betterment on a higher rung, then I would rest pretty easy. Has faith played a role in your work?
It is. That's an important part of my life. I'm very active at my church. I go to Renaissance Church of God in Christ. Bishop Dennis McMurray is my pastor. And I'm active at my church. But, whatever the God of anyone's faith is that's listening, if that is part of what keeps you grounded, I think then we should secure, to what does that. And my faith does help keep me grounded.
Well, of course, the civil rights movement was imbued with faith from start to finish. I mean, many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were pastors, ministers, and I think their moral vision is what has helped sustain the memory of those individuals and the movement itself in our nation. Well, we have viewers who are queuing up to ask questions, but I want to ask you one more question myself before we turn to the viewers. I'd like to know, so you've had this career where you're very dedicated to racial reconciliation and teaching. What's going to be the capstone of your career? What's going to be, you mentioned Champ Bailey. I'm a Broncos fan, by the way.
All right.
So I'm sorry, I know must have been a San Diego Chargers fan.
That's a different conversation.
Okay. So I guess my question is, what's your World Series? What's your Super Bowl?
So if Ken were to ride off in the sunset, I guess I'll look back. If people say, Ken was a man of character, he did what he said what he did, and he left things better than he found them. That in itself would just mean the world to me. That would be my swan song. Leaving legacies. But, I've been part of some inaugural things, communities I've worked in, have established citizen police review boards. I've helped build some supplier diversity initiatives that are still in place. So I know that there are women-owned, minority-owned businesses that are thriving now because of things I put in place. That watching it be successful is a pat on the back. And that would make me, again, feel very good at the end of my career.
Very good. Okay, we've got some viewers asking questions, Ken. How should parents and mentors discuss the current climate with children? One viewer writes, that's a good question.
That's a very good question. So one, and this is my experience, and I'm married to an educator, so I have some education. Kids are aware of the world around them, and sometimes they need answers. So I would say age-appropriate books. I would recommend to anyone to also let children see heroes different than the ethnicity that you might be. So I think it's okay to show a book, and I'm speaking of like elementary kids that show women in leadership roles, that show people of color in leadership roles, just to let them know that that's part of the collective society. And then be prepared to answer those questions. Also, sometimes it just takes exposure. So, the racism discussion, it can be very challenging, but a little diversification around, a neighborhood that you go have ice cream in a different neighborhood. So people can see, oh, I can do this and be comfortable around someone that looks different than me. Go to a restaurant you wouldn't normally go to. So start with that foundational stuff and then let that build up into a larger platform.
Another viewer asks, could you speak to some of the work of the business community of Grand Rapids and how that community is responding to and challenging each of the forms of racism that you outlined for us earlier? Another good question.
Very good question. So one thing, like I said, the Grand Rapids Chamber is here to convene, collaborate, and to bring unification. So we have tools with our businesses where we can meet them where they're at on their journey. So if an organization is just starting with the journey, we can meet them there. For organizations that may have been on the journey for a while around diversity and inclusion and it's kind of stalled or hit a roadblock, we can have that conversation as well. What I can tell you is there are many businesses, I won't call them by name, that have started this journey, and they're doing it for the right reasons, not to put it on the front page of when you open your internet or however you search your news, but they're doing it because it's the right thing to do for their employees, their organization, and their stakeholders. So there are many things taking place in this organization, in this community, many things taking place in this community. And there are many organizations to be commended doing that work.
Another viewer asks, there have been many protests and movements all over the country and over the world, in fact, as a result of the murder of George Floyd. Ken, where have you found hope that there will be continued positive momentum and change here in Grand Rapids, in the nation, and in our world? It's an ambitious question.
Yes, it is. It is. And this is my opinion. Others might disagree with it. I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the word real when I say there needs to be real change. And what I mean by real change is I would hate for however long, 2 years from now, another incident to come up and things were the same. So now that we have an opportunity to have real change off of these conversations, I'm hoping we can do it. So when we draw attention to institutional or structural racism, that we can start to dismantle some of these things so that there is real change, so that we don't see these things continue to affect people of color.
Another viewer asks, what you think the real changes can take place so that the Black members of our community are safer?
Again, this is my opinion, with that. So, as a male, and I present, as a large male, I can tell you my experiences, and I'm not embellishing them at all, that sometimes I'm stereotyped or discriminated against or treated differently to do that. I'm hoping that those counter narratives, when I said earlier that when someone tells you a story and they listen, so I'm hoping that we can get some counter narratives out there. So one, we're minimizing negative interactions. And then when we do that, we have a more empathetic response to things like, okay, someone did break the law, they happen to be a person of color, let's just stop the situation, arrest them, take them in, and treat them without violating their civil rights. So I'm hoping that and that's what we want to see happen. So again, I don't condone violence or anything, but the spark that set this off is when you can see something play out like that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, what we're talking about now, that has to stop. And if those things can stop and people sit down, really listen, make that real change we're talking about, I think we can have a better world come out of it.
I want to thank Emily Smith for submitting an excellent question. Well, Ken, is there anything else you'd like to mention that we haven't covered?
There's a couple of things, so that come to mind is how can we have that conversation? So again, I've had people, and again, where someone is at, I respect that. You are at where you're at, but if you genuinely want to talk and have a conversation and come to me and say, Ken, help me understand. I don't understand, why people are rioting right now. I will share with you why I think we are, which to me it's obvious, but again, I'll share with that. But take a step to meet me from my viewpoint, and I'll take a step to meet you there, and hopefully we can find consensus there. So there's that conversation, that we're talking about. The other thing is silence. For those of you that believe that Black lives do indeed matter, and if you're in a space where there are not people of color represented, that's where that white allyship can come in. Don't be silent. Sometimes, silence, can kind of go with the status quo. So I would, challenge respectfully that if you are you have an opportunity to speak up on the behalf of anything that would better, the racial reconciliation. It's not easy sometimes, but please, we need that voice.
Very good. Very good. Well, this has certainly been illuminating. Thank you, Ken James, for being my guest on today's Lunch and Learn. It has been both a pleasure and enlightening to speak with you. I think our viewers got a lot out of today's session. And I invite those who tuned in to fill out the brief survey and let us know what you thought of today's program. I also invite you to Zoom in or join us on Facebook at the same time Tuesday, June 16th, for our next live Lunch and Learn webcast featuring Jason Duncan, who teaches American history at Aquinas College. Jason has written a wonderful biography of John F. Kennedy and is currently working on a biography of Martin Van Buren, who's a lot more interesting than you think. So tell your friends and colleagues about us. Till Tuesday, stay tuned to all our Hauenstein Center offerings and stay well.